Okay, greetings everybody, and welcome to Mahamudra for the People. We're going to continue with Tulopa's Ganji's Mahamudra. We're actually just down to the last, I think it's 2 stanzas or so. We're thereabouts, yeah, 2, 3. Um, but yeah, it's wonderful to be here with everybody. And I was figuring we could begin by just, sitting for a little bit, maybe 15 minutes, just as a way of stabilizing the mind, right? Stabilizing our experience of reality, whatever that is slash means. So allow yourself to get as comfortable as you can. A little bit of discipline, right? Seated a little straight, not killing your body. You don't need to be a statue. You can just be yourself. Let your body be stable. Let your breath be relaxed. Right? Don't force anything. Right? Letting go of the past. Right? So spending a little bit of time letting go of everything that's happened before this moment. And then taking a little bit of time letting go of everything that might come to pass, right? So the future, just let go of the future. And give yourself that benefit. And then let go of the present moment needing to be any particular way or any particular thing. And let go of control. Let go of trying to figure anything out. Right? This is not a puzzle. And just rest. Resting into open, spacious awareness. And we'll sit like this for 15 minutes. Okay. So, I'm going to walk back just a couple stanzas from where we left off, just so that there's a little bit of flow. Flow is helpful. And if anybody has any questions, actually, does anybody have any questions from last week or anything? Maybe we can start off by checking in and see how everyone's doing. Yes, yeah, Richard.
Yeah, good morning. There's something that's been hanging around in my mind, which is that I can't forget the image of your acquaintance, the Vipassana practitioner in India, sitting under a tree while a tiger walks past. Actually, more than one tiger, and I found myself thinking, what has Mahamudra or Trekcho as a practice got to offer a Vipassana meditator who can remain seated and in a non-dualistic state while a tiger wanders past, which is almost by definition man-eating. So it's just something about the labels that we attach to Shamatha, Vipassana, Mahamudra, and the way that I and others around me have been trained is that Mahamudra is the kind of pinnacle of the lineage's practices. And I just found myself looking for the distinction really between, the clear seeing of Vipassana and the other really kind of difficult to define practice of Mahamudra, and wondering how much of it is about labeling and just kind of what your thoughts are on that, really.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a hard thing to define, I've always found,
Yeah, I mean, starting off, I could say that then there are like Nyingma folks who are like, well, then there's Dzogchen, which is above Mahamudra. Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, this,
and then there's the tiger,
and then there's a tiger who's like, who are all these people? What, why are they so weird? And why did they think I'm scary? Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't think that there's a ton of value placed on labeling, what is higher, what is better. I mean, there's a lot of really, and again, like so I'll speak a little critically of like the religious tradition that tends to kind of go back to like reassign some of these practices, for example, to the Buddha. Like if we're going to be historically in alignment, then we could say that the Buddha practiced what we know as Theravadan Buddhism because the Mahayana didn't exist at that time and the Vajrayana didn't exist necessarily at that time. And then there are all these, magical ways and that actually they did, right? That, that it was secret, it was a secret oral thing, and who knows, right? Like that part, I don't think anybody's ever going to be able to answer outside of, some kind of visionary experience. But even then, it's kind of like visionary experience to define these things, it's very personal and not necessarily historical. When we talk about Vipassana, right, we're talking about awareness practice, right? Even a kind of light Vipassana or mild Vipassana, which might only address, the labeling of feelings or emotions, right? That's an awareness practice, right? And I suspect that as these practices get deeper, right, I don't think there probably is necessarily a whole lot of distinguishing difference between how far awareness can be experienced with Vipassana in a Theravadan context, and then how far it can be experienced, in a Mahamudra context, or even an Hatha Yoga context, right? Like I just don't know. I don't really buy into these kinds of classifications. Like you find this with every kind of form, especially of Vajrayana, where every single thing is the best, the highest. Like the ultimate practice might be Lamdre. No, it's Mahamudra. No, it's the 6 yogas of Naropa. No, it's the 6 yogas of Naguma. No, it's Chakra Samvara, perfect for these times. No, it's some other thing. I truly do believe, this kind of other model, that there are as many ways to awakening as there are people. And if there are, so kind of like, there are 84,000 types of Dharma, which is kind of what that point is getting at. So I don't think, I personally, I know others feel differently, but I personally don't know what kind of benefit there is in distinguishing, an exceptionally advanced practitioner of the Theravadan, models of Vipassana, and somebody who practices Dzogchen or Mahamudra, and I think the more we can apply the view of all of these to these kinds of questions, we begin to see that the need for distinction and categorization of what is better Dharma, what is more profound Dharma, etc., is solely a human conceptual problem, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
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 And at the same time, like I also, somebody reached out to me a couple days ago, asking me, like, what the techniques are to be able to kind of gauge people's recognition of awareness. And their question was kind of, within the context of the Rigpa state. And there is this kind of like interview style examination. And as we were kind of going back and forth, this was through WhatsApp. So, they would leave a message, I would listen, and I would leave a message, and, back and forth. This person was very interested in kind of, the whole span of non-dual practices, right? So, Mahamudra, Dzogchen, Pejmari, Vedanta practices, a whole host of things. And they wanted to kind of bring everything together into some sort of grand theory of like, of non-duality. And I told them that, I used to kind of be a little bit interested in this, but I'm not interested in it anymore, because the one thing I have kind of come to find, at least for myself, is that mastery of something happens, at least for me, when I have a limited, sphere of things I am working on, right? So if I'm practicing Mahamudra and Dzogchen, that's about enough. Mahamudra, Dzogchen, and some Yogini Tantra stuff, that's enough, right? But I think that it doesn't really matter what we practice so much, as long as we practice something and we go deeply into that. And I think that most, very diligent practitioners can come out the other end in places that are quite similar, if that makes sense, or if that's, hopefully that's not unclear. But, I guess I want to kind of like just name the chauvinism that exists within the Vajrayana towards other yanas, and maybe call that out a little bit, right? And say that I don't think that that's true. I mean, what about the Sufi tradition, or, the Shakti traditions, or the Bhakti traditions, right? Like I'm not, or let's say I don't need to prove anybody wrong, because I'm not interested in, like, that's not why I practice Dharma, to prove other people wrong. I practice Dharma to prove myself wrong, right? My investment
Yeah, yeah.
and samsara. But it's a it's a good question. But I mean, like, really, like, if you put the Buddha and Guru Rinpoche together, right? Like, different kinds of practice, but I think they would they would recognize one another's awakening, right? Like, I don't,
Absolutely, yeah.
you know, and I think also probably my work, like, as a chaplain, also kind of helps support this kind of idea where it like, again, it's for the very religious person who has a lot to either gain or lose by taking a very religious orthodox position, then I think these things are very important, right? If you don't really care so much because you're comfortable in yourself, you're comfortable in your practice, and you're comfortable in other people's practice, and the difference in the way in which other people's practice can look from ours, then it's not so much of a big deal. Kind of maybe going back to the thing I've said before about having a cosmopolitan view on these kinds of things. Like, there is a lot of fear in people's hearts, though, that I think should be named too. Fear of, oh, am I, maybe lack of confidence of the path, around their path, or fear that maybe they're wasting time, or and this is where these kinds of issues become really kind of problematic, when there's a lack of certainty within the mind of the practitioner around the practice that they're doing. Then the next person who comes into town who's trying to propagate a different kind of practice will invariably kind of destabilize these people, because there's not a lot of confidence, right? Not a lot of feeling centered and directed and grounded in one's own practice. But I also think a lot of these things kind of solve themselves over time, which is kind of an issue of maturity in practice too. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I mean, it seems to me that a lot of it really comes down to presence, and the increasing possibility of luminous presence, or whichever. And I have no doubt that Vipassana practitioners, have that within their scope. It's just that there's such an intense focus sometimes on these categories and the very kind of nebulous definitions of what Mahamudra actually is, that I wanted to sort of raise that and get your feelings about it. So it's very helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a good question. And I mean, the other thing, so just as a like for me, or within me, or whatever, like what I do find a little challenging are systems, and this is just a personal thing on my part, systems where everything is hyper defined, in terms of, this leads into this, to that, because we're all a little different, or sometimes all a lot different, and the way in which things arise. Sometimes we'll have these sudden experiences, sometimes we'll have these slow gradual experiences, sometimes even there's a really interesting essay, I think it's by Klaus Dieter Matthes, actually, Eric, on Naropa's like presentation of the four joys and Maitreya's presentation of the four joys, and they're different. They're not in the same order, so then the person is very kind of like scholastic will be like, well, who is right, who influenced who, and the thing is when you actually read through these, you can begin to see how these four joys might arise in different order for different people. And why this is important and why I'm bringing it up is because it just means that sometimes we don't, it's not really super wise to hold a very rigid view on first comes this, then comes that, then comes this, then comes that. And that has always been a little hard for me to digest. Maybe I'm a little too critical, because just we're all different. Right? Our experiences are different, and not only just in terms of our lives, like, in this quote unquote life, but then if you really are subscribing to this, the multi-life reincarnation kind of aspect of the Buddhist path, then it gets even more complicated, because what is happening in this life isn't necessarily the only thing that's at play. There are all of these other forces and the ways in which things manifest. So there's a little bit of questioning I have in terms of everything being really, it seems like a very human thing to have everything really neatly ordered, but I don't think we are that way. So these kind of organic things or approaches, I think, are a little bit more helpful and realistic. Any other questions? No? Yeah. Malika, yes, yes.
Hi, I'm sorry I'm new to this group, so I don't know if this is the kind of direction, but nice to see you all. I'm wondering, maybe I'm having a kind of chauvinism within my own practice, but I'm curious about the experience for you all, and maybe you can speak to this, Lama Justin, of your experiential difference between formless shamatha and just resting in rigpa or awareness. Because I feel like there's the flickering of the aggregates kind of regardless, like almost like, I think where my dualism gets really rigid is the body. Like the body feels like the home of the self, if from the point of view of conceptual mind. And then in practice, there's more and more subtlety that comes in, such that the body starts like flickering a bit. And then there's like sort of the feeling that no one's home, but it's not like the aggregates disappear either. And so sometimes I'm like, in practice, I'm like, oh, I don't really worry about it. I'm just going to try to be uncontrived. But then afterwards, I'm like, am I just like having formless shamatha where there's a nice sliver of, maybe more of a sliver of duality? Then I'm like, I don't know. I don't know if I would know experientially the difference between those two. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a good question. It's like, I really like this kind of question, because it also begins to highlight how trained we can become from shamatha. Like, so, if one does shamatha a lot, which is a great practice, and I don't, definitely not critical of it, but there's a big difference between resting in effortless awareness and resting into shamatha in terms of the application of some kind of control, right? Some kind of step. And so I do think formless shamatha is a real easy, natural kind of departure point for resting directly into rigpa, which is why it's positioned that way. Like, at least in the Karmakaju tradition, like, moving from breath to visual object to visualized object to resting in mind, into mind itself as the anchor. So in these like real big like Rigpa moments, like of very strong clarity of Rigpa, it often can feel like everything dissolves, right? And there is nothing. Yeah, sometimes it can feel like we're in the middle of outer space. Sometimes it can feel like there is no tangible location for things. I think though also kind of piggybacking off the like last some of my answer to the last question, I don't think there are hard edges either though, between one or the other, right? So it's I guess what I'm saying is like I think there on top of everything else that's complicated, then there's also typology of the practitioner, right? And so some practitioners can go from that formless shamatha straight into a very expansive experience of awareness that is not necessarily shamatha based, right? Others kind of will stay in it in shamatha there too. I also feel like the question can only exist if there's a goal in mind, right? Like if there is no goal, we can't really have this question, right? The goal is to rest directly into unfabricated state. Sometimes we have capacity to do that, and sometimes we don't, right? And when we have capacity, I mean, obviously, like yes, in an ultimate sense, we all have capacity to always do that, right? But what is playing out in a meditation session, a formal meditation session, can be different. So if we find ourselves in the shamatha state, where there is an element of control, right, an element of direction, right, I am doing this, right, there's an implementation of this remedy, right, or this tool or this technique, right, then we're not resting completely effortlessly in the experience of Rigpa. And there can be this, Rigpa can exist while conceptual mind is present, right? I mean, it does, right? Like we're talking and thinking and referring to, concepts, and Rigpa is naturally expansive at the same time. It's creative, it's responsive, it's pure, it's vast, there is no center, there is no edge, and yet we make use of the conceptual mind at the same time. So this kind of differentiation between the two is helpful and not helpful at the same time. It's helpful in the sense of trying to kind of understand where we're going, and that's where it's very helpful, right? Or where we get stuck. When we had this Trekcha retreat last year at Pure Land Farms, there was somebody there who said that they kept falling into this shamatha experience while they were trying to rest into Trekcha, right? But part of this is conditioning. For this person, it was just conditioning. They've done tons and tons of shamatha, and so they kind of fall right into that habit. So breaking that habit becomes important. But I also think that judging ourselves is also not particularly helpful nor important in this too. Like, so when we notice or are critical even of our practice, it's fine to do that. But I think it, if there is no time and there is no end, like especially with respect to Mahamudra and Dzogchen, like the mind is already perfect, right? The mind is already pure. The mind is already without limitation. So how to rest into that is not aided so much by post facto analysis of what just happened. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's It does. Thank you. That's very helpful. I struggle. I think I just struggle with this because I feel like there is a strong narrative in the tradition, especially Mahamudra, which seems so staged in some way. It's like kind of like know where you are.
Mhm.
But I do hear what you're saying, that that question sort of comes with a goal in mind. I also think that the question also is related to like talk in Mahamudra about the Great Seal being about like the joining of shamatha and vipassana. And it does seem like at the level of Rigpa, there's like like when I think of formless shamatha, I think of like a practitioner who's like resting with open presence, and open presence is kind of has a thingness to it. And like the practitioner is sort of over here resting in open presence. And there's like a thingness to both. And then when I think about like Rigpa or my experiences, however brief of that, there is sort of a self-existing shamatha, almost like it just does it on its own somehow. And I think, yeah, obviously I don't know. I struggle within the tradition of like, is it important to know where you are while you're still on the path and not having like a stable, constant Rigpa experience? And, or should you just totally let that all go and like, not assess your sort of, not assess your practice at all in some way.
Mhm.
But yeah, I'll leave it at that. But thank you. That's
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, you bring up a ton of good points, Malika. One of them too is, and I have to say, like my like, so this union, Mahamudra being like very classically defined as shamatha first and vipassana second, is kind of two steps, is incredibly beautiful in terms of its skillful means, right? But when you look at these early Mahamudra texts, like, we've been doing here, like Tulopa, Saraha, Maitrepa even, nowhere do they never bring this up, right? These texts are a lot more like, these early Dzogchen texts where it's just like, just rest, just stop, just, allow the mind to rest in its natural state, right? Leave it like a river, leave it like the sky, leave it like the clouds. And the way it appears is the techniques developed over time, this shamatha and vipassana, and again, it's good, it's helpful because it's very clear, but it's also, I remember when Bokramche first taught like Lakong, and it was so hard to rest into that and not have the conceptual mind come in. It wasn't until a bit later that I kind of recognized, oh, wait, hold on, like, this is how you do it. That to me feels so like overly structured. And this is where the individual practitioner piece comes in. Like I've always experienced that as like hard, clunky, overly structured. I like the fast push, but then I've known all sorts of people over time, especially who are Boku Rinpoche students, who really thrived with the development of shamatha, right, and the quiescence that creates. And then I will make this argument, though. I think that it is almost inevitable that from this experience of shamatha, especially without any particular anchor other than the mind itself, that moving into natural awareness becomes almost inevitable, right? Because you're going from very subtle resting into the experience of mind itself as the anchor, and then where is mind? Like, it's not in the body. It's not even in this room. It's not, even though there's a country, it's 3,000 miles between where you are and I am, right? It extends even beyond that, right? So if shamatha is truly going, if mind is truly going to be the anchor, it's very natural then to kind of just move into the mind's reflexive awareness of itself, right? So, or the resting into awareness, which has the ability to be able to know the mind that it's experiencing, right? Whether it's conceptual mind or if it's awareness itself, because Rigpa can recognize Rigpa. So I think that as to your last point, like I definitely feel like, you know, kind of knowing where we are in our practice is helpful. But I kind of feel like sometimes knowing too much is never helpful, because like this like narrative creation, it's like how to practice so passively that we don't get into a narrative creation. You know, how to be so passive. And it's interesting because like I'm interested in this, and it's completely useless, like, you know, for our lives to just rest without any narrative, right? To have absolutely no care or concern, you know. So these instructions, like rest like a corpse or like a simpleton, or, you know, to not get involved. Because it's interesting, right? Like there's a part of us that wants to be able to verify, but you can't verify without values, right? Um, and so again, you know, I think that a lot of these things resolve themselves for most of us, because as everything becomes increasingly subtle, we're like, oh, wait a minute, like I can't actually, I can say I experience Rigpa, but I can't say I'm not experiencing Rigpa right now, because Rigpa is still here constantly all the time, right? And it's not particularly helpful to begin to differentiate between pure Rigpa state and impure Rigpa state, or even, you know, it's also fascinating too, and then I'm going to be quiet, but like, you know, even in terms of our body, like let's say like I have a, you know, low high blood pressure problem, right? So in that, right, that can affect my mood, right? So this is a really good example of like a biological, you know, thing that can affect my mood. As that affects my mood, that affects my experience of conceptual mind, right? When my blood pressure is low, that is not happening, right? So it's complicated, right? It's not just like there is our body in relationship to all of this. There's our emotional state and what's going on in our lives. We could be going through a period of incredible loss, right, or grief, and there's just a lot of tumultuous, or depression, right, or rage. And so the having an overly, and I'm not saying that you're doing this at all, but like anyone having kind of like an overly structured view of what is good or bad in our practice is going to be suffering. Because if it's not like a biological thing that's impacting our practice, or an emotional thing, or some other kind of physical thing, or you know, like, I guess my question is, why go there when this is kind of more about like a work in progress, that if we're going to judge it at all, has to be judged over a wide time span, because this moment is just so small, if that makes sense. I don't know if that makes sense to people. Yeah, Casey. Oh, Casey. Casey. Namo exhaustion. Oh, okay, okay. Okay. Well, thank you for being our teacher. Nice. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, these are all great questions. and they all speak to like confidence, right? Like wanting confidence, and not that we need confidence, but like, it's like we want to be able to be confident in what we're doing, no matter what we're doing, whether it's meditation or some other thing. And this work of being really curious, I think, is important. Being methodical is important. Being slow is important. Being fast is important. Being able to shift gears. But to remember even how our relationship to duality can make suffering for ourselves, even in relationship to the way we think of our practice. I mean, the "who cares" line, that Casey shared, I think is like an increasingly important instruction for me, for myself, right? Is whenever particular things arise, oh, well, who cares? Like, not to not go there, to not pick it up, to not get too involved. And then that's just for me, cool. Well, is it okay to kind of come back to the text? Yeah, okay, cool. So I just walked this back a couple of stanzas. So Lopa says, total freedom from all extremes is the king of views. Profound depth and edgelessness is the supreme king of meditation. And then freedom from extremes and bias is the supreme king of conduct. And abiding naturally, free from hope and fear, is the supreme result. And so, again, starting from the beginning of this stanza, this freedom from extremes is the king of views, right? Or the queen of views. Letting go of good and bad, letting go, and not only of good and bad, right? But letting go of the need to classify. And so even just kind of looking in terms of like labeling, right? Again, like we've been doing, look at your room where you are or wherever you happen to be, and look at the objects and the colors, and if there's any movement in that room, and things that might be made of wood or metal or glass or plants or what have you, handle. Beholding all of these without labeling, without value judgment, and letting everything just be free, open, dynamic. Right? This is occupancy of the non-dual state, is occupying this location of not even lifting a finger of meaning making, not even lifting a finger of, oh, this is that, this thing is that, this thing has all this history behind it, this thing has another thing, right? It's just all there. And profound depth, profound depth and edgelessness is the supreme king of meditation, or supreme queen of meditation, right? Depth, no center, no edge. So even, this is interesting. Like it might be worth letting go of everything we've ever heard. I was talking with somebody earlier today about somatic this and that, and they're like these things that are really they become popular terms, right? Like spiritual bypassing, right? Becomes popular. Then everything becomes spiritual bypassing, we see. But then it's somatic, everything, somatic. Like, we can't, there's nothing new about somatics, right? Because we've had bodies for our whole lives. All humans have had bodies, and we've felt or not felt. We've felt in our body and not felt in our body, right? within the context of Mahamudra, resting into the experience of everything that's occurring, right? When it's without center and without edge, this also means giving up our preferences about how we experience things. A preference around somatic experience, right? Letting even that go. No center means try to let go of this. Let go of this body. You're not going to freak out. You're not going to lose your mind. You're not going to die. You're not going to disappear even. Right? But learning how to disrupt through release of this physicality being the center of everything. Right? Which is why also the narrative stuff, becomes important to disrupt too. Oh, my name is Justin and blah, blah, blah. I've got all this stuff and blah, blah, blah. I'm this person and blah, blah, blah. This is how I got to be here. And then eventually I'll die, and somebody will have a reaction perhaps. And then, I'll take rebirth somewhere else. And then, blah, 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 waste of time, waste of energy. It doesn't make me more or less alive to engage the process of narrative making. In fact, it projects a tremendous amount of energy and sometimes violence onto the world around and even onto myself. And one of the ultimate forms of nonviolence is to stop labeling. The freedom from extremes and bias is the supreme king of conduct. And of course, we can align this with our politics and say, no bias meaning this, but really bias meaning everything. Freedom from extremes and bias around everything. Right? And this doesn't mean go do things, if you have a predilection towards doing good things, do bad things. It doesn't mean that. It just means begin to let go of this tight system of label, judge, 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 label, judge. Yeah, it's a little bit like how with kids, if they're running and they trip, this happened recently to my youngest son, and nobody reacts, he'll usually get up and like dust himself off and be like, fine, but recently I overreacted. I was like, oh my God, are you okay? And it was something he's like falling down all the time. And this one time he was just like, oh my God, and just, beside himself with sadness and hurt and all of this. And it's not to say the hurt or sadness isn't consequential or important, right? But it is this kind of thing where the more sometimes we create threads of connection to everything, the more we're going to feel everything in ways that are samsaric, right? They're just because we feel doesn't mean it's like I could feel fine and then somebody could walk in here and offer me like a teacup full of shit, right? And I could then say, oh my God, I can't believe you gave this to me. Like, this is disgusting. Like, get out of here. Now all of a sudden I'm angry, right? And it's not that I also have to drink the cup of shit or like take my finger and like, clean out the cup of shit with my finger. But that instantaneous labeling, right? Labeling and creation of, what comes next and what my reaction should be. And, all of this stuff, all of a sudden we go from like, relative equanimity to relative hot hell or cold hell or in between kind of experience. So freedom from extremes and bias is the supreme king of conduct. When abiding naturally free from hope and fear is the supreme result. free from hope and fear. Right? That essentially means free from desired outcome. You can't hope and without desired outcome, and you can't have fear without a desired outcome. Right? So that also means labeling, wanting. This is what I mean, I think, when I say that this is it's a practice of open, relaxed passivity. So then he goes on to say, action is at first like a torrent in a ravine. So we talked about this last week. So, when we're sitting for the first time, we start, our mind is wild, right? It's unpleasant. We notice all of the speed, all of the reactivity, all the discomfort. Sometimes we just notice how tired we are, right? How irritated we are. Oh God, this sucks. I remember feeling that way about meditation. This is so horrible. Oh my God, my mind, man, like is this ever going to chill out? Of course, then in the middle, it moves slowly like the Ganges, right? So theoretically, Tilopa and Naropa were sitting on the Ganga when Tilopa was teaching this. And so with more practice, the mind becomes more at ease, more relaxed. Why? Because it knows itself. Right? It understands itself. Right? Our conceptual mind is exceptionally predictable and not very original, unfortunately. So like the way we react, what happens when we poke it, prod it, slap it around, it's very predictable, right? The more we're able to just rest with ease in the moment, it settles itself. And it's not just in the Mahamudra tradition. They talk about this in the Dzogchen tradition as well. And this comes with time. And then, of course, it says at the end, it's like, so it's like a river meeting the sea, right? And one of the metaphors, it's like, a child meeting its mother, right? So there's actually joy and equanimity that arises. So, and then Tilopa goes on to say that beings with inferior minds do not rest in this state, but they hold their breath while disregarding the awareness of the essence. Right? So this is like this kind of hatha yoga, or it could be hatha yoga, but it also can be focusing too much on the breath, right? Like remembering that this is about awareness, right? So if you hold your breath without focusing your awareness, right? That's this kind of, Tilopa is saying this is a little bit of a kind of pointless practice. And then he says that through many aspects of fixing the mind, through looking, awareness does not rest in its true state, but ends up being restrained. So if we're trying to control, trying to make something happen, right? Awareness is not able to just rest in its own state. It is restrained, right? So if we are focusing too much in this shamatha way, because it's still myopic, right? My breath. If we're focusing on is breath, right? It's good. It's not a bad practice, right? But it's not Mahamudra. Right? We want to let awareness go. This is a little bit like that encounter with Vrupa and Sukhasiddhi, where Sukhasiddhi had this pot that she dropped and it cracked. And when it cracked, the lid was stuck on it. And when it cracked, she recognized the contents from within the pot and the atmosphere, the contents of the atmosphere, as it were, joined like that, right? And this was a big awakening experience for her, because it was kind of like, ultimate mind and relative mind meeting together. It's the mother clear light and the child clear light is what that's symbolizing, right? So for this practice of just letting awareness go to its edge, right? That's more the practice of Mahamudra. So then, this is where we paused last time. So I'll get to the sexy part, a little mention of Karma Mudra. So, here Tilopa says, by depending on Karma Mudra, the wisdom of bliss and emptiness arises. Entering union through the blessing of method and wisdom, gently descending, filling, reversing, drawing up, bringing to the sight and spread throughout the body. So this has, this is sexual yoga. And why is Tilopa bringing this up? So this is actually also a really good example of how these kind of earlier Mahamudra texts are different than later ones, right? The later ones actually tended to be developed within kind of the monastic system, and so there wouldn't necessarily be a lot of Karma Mudra reference. But here too, like you could actually probably even just change in Tumo for Karma Mudra in terms of what the intention of this is, right? The intention is, through the process of, engaging in Karma Mudra, which is a sexual yoga in which one, basically, there's this interaction between, you're causing the white drops in the, located in the head to descend gently. This is what it says, gently descending, then filling, and then reversing and drawing back up, is this kind of internal yogic process associated with the sexual yoga. Now, this causes, though, this incredible bliss. And the bliss, this is why Tilopa is bringing it up, is because the blissfulness of this completely arrests the conceptual mind, right? And so this same kind of thing can be experienced with Tumo. As well, Tumo, often, people talk a lot about the heat part of Tumo, which is part of the practice. The way bliss can arise, it can be quite intense also in Tumo. And when that happens, right, there's easily this experience of complete cessation of conceptual thought, right? And not in a dead or dull way, but of vacuity, right? An absence of conceptuality, and one is just left in this Rigpa state, right? So Tilopa brings this up as this is another way to experience Mahamudra, right? Through the practice of Karma Mudra. And then he goes on to say, if there's no attachment to that, the wisdom of bliss and emptiness will arise, right? So the moment, and this is the same with Tumo too. Like if one becomes too enamored by the process of Tumo, right, then it's a grasping experience, right? There's an attachment, and that attachment doesn't let us rest into equanimity. Right? And the same thing with Karma Mudra. So when that bliss is, but the thing is that when that bliss is authentically there, there's not even really an issue of question about this, right? In the face of that bliss, you cannot but rest into the non-dual state, right? If there's attachment in addition to the bliss, then there are problems, right? Now, the other benefits that Karma Mudra has, according to Tilopa, is that one will have a long life without white hair, and one will be bright, clear, glowing, and as strong as a lion. And then ordinary cities will quickly be attained, including engaging with the experience of the ultimate nature of reality. And then he goes on to say, may this essential instruction of Mahamudra dwell in the hearts of worthy beings. And this is where it ends. So there's a colophon that says this came from the mouth of the great Tilopa, who had the spontaneous accomplishment of Mahamudra. Tilopa taught this on the bank of the Ganges to the Kashmiri Pandita and scholar, the Siddha Naropa, at the conclusion of his 12 hardships. The 28 Vajra verses of Mahamudra was dictated by the great Naropa and was received and translated and revised by the great Tibetan Lotsawa, the king of translators, Marpa Chokilodro at Pulahari, to the north of Nalanda. So a little bit of Karma Mudra in there to just shake things up. But, I think this is important, like, yeah, I mean, it's important to talk about Karma Mudra because it's important to talk about sexuality, right? If we're going to really be, especially if we're going to be people who, are practicing something like Mahamudra, but this is the case also with Yidam practice and everything else. And, I do think that Karma Mudra, it's a complicated topic. Absolutely. I get that. And, all of the abuse that has happened in various kinds of sanghas, obviously, guarantees that this is complicated. But even because it's complicated, though, or because it's complicated, doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about it and begin to explore, what our relationship may or may not be to this kind of practice. And, I think the other thing is like, it's worth trusting ourselves. I'm not saying everybody here has to practice Karma Mudra, but we can talk about it and trust ourselves and trust others too, around this. Yeah, any questions about that? Or anything? Any questions? It's totally. Yeah, Malika.
Thank you so much. That's so beautiful. And I had a question about what you were commenting on the text about the labeling. I guess I have it feels like that's just what the conceptual mind does. And so whenever people are like, don't label, I'm like, is that just a shorthand for, because it seems like thought ultimately is creative if it can just be seen as non-existent, ultimately, like that it's just not, almost like meditating with the moving mind. Like when people say dissolve or don't label, or I think I often get a little stuck with that instruction because I'm like, isn't the Nirmanakaya ultimately just the creative display of form while knowing that it's doesn't ultimately exist? Like, in other words, like I'm thinking of an example of, yeah, I think I've used this example before, but like I go into a hospital room and there's a male presenting person with a mustache and a beard. Mm-hmm. And they say, hi, my name's Melissa. And for a moment, the mind is like, I see the mind have its conditioned response of like, wait, what? And then I'm like, there it goes again. And that's another thought of like, slog of that conditioned thought. But that whole thing is like, it doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like the burning off of something that's just like, and so I think it's also when people say things like that it all dissolves. I'm like, oh, I don't have that experience of everything pulling and disappearing act, more like more like it becomes holographic in some way. And I just sometimes feel inadequate, I guess, when I'm like hearing these things. Is it that the less you grab at this labeling and see it as solid, the less it happens, maybe? And it does really dissolve for people in that way?
Yeah. So again, great questions. It's not that things disappear necessarily, but that can happen. It's that things are able to happen without the person needing to contextualize them, right? So even if one notices, wow, Melissa, and then totally just let it dissolve. I mean, dissolve. I'll use a different word, evaporate. Like, let the words die right there. Let the designation completely drop dead. No life force. Boom. Like a corpse. And then just be. So this like it's tricky, right? Because like with our senses, we recognize color, form, all sorts of things, right? We can behold these without classification. So there's like in front of me, there's all this like, glam Dharma stuff, right? There's like the golden statue of Dilsuma. And so I can have my eyes open and notice that. And there's a circum and candle, other things all around. But I can do that without labeling any of it. It's just happening. It's just there. And so it's there. I see it. I'm able to, encounter it. I can get up and, move it if I need to. Right. But there's no there's little to no real interaction happening, right? Other than the direct recognition of the experience of the thing, right? And this, though, like there are a couple of ways of quote unquote getting to that experience. And one is, like the so, I was just reading this, which is why it's kind of fresh in my mind. But Dr. Nita's text on the weapon of light, and he mentions that the thought activity will naturally subside the more we practice, right? The more we understand, the nature of thought, the more we experience it, the more we, really get to know it. The same way we get to know like a good friend, right? Like we might know that when they get, hangry, they're really not nice to be around, or they might get jealous about particular things. That's just a personality trait or a foible, the same way we all have them, right? Thought, our relationship to thought and conceptual mind can be similar. And so the more we just kind of, rest and observe, notice, resting into awareness, the more over time, like a pet that trusts you, it's able to just go to sleep at your feet, right? It trusts you, right? It's able to just settle without provocation, without, hey, wait a minute, like wake up, wake up, wake up. Right. And the more we're able to do that, the more that even when something comes up, when someone's like, yeah, hi, my name is Melissa, and you recognize, oh, that was, it totally caught me off guard or whatever. And then just drop that, just let it go. Like there's I guess maybe closely related to this is relinquishing the need to like autocorrect, right? Or course correct. Like, oh, wait a minute, I just, let it go. Like, let it go. Like I'm probably traumatized from like early like romantic relationships, like early meaning like high school age kind of thing, right? So it's very natural for me to be like jerky and kind of like check in, like in new relationships. Not that I'm having any new relationships, but should I be in a new relationship, there's a high likelihood that I will invariably fall back on some patterning around checking in to make sure, oh, does this person really like me, like kind of thing, right? Like and so like there's this kind of need that can be there sometimes for me to check, oh wait, let me make sure, is this real, like it's too good to be true, whatever, right? And so an equivalent of that coming up in our practice is not uncommon too, where we want to be able to for love of the practice, for love of the path, for good reasons, want to make sure that, oh, wait a minute, like I just got distracted, or I'm feeling tired, what should I do now, or whatever, to just whatever experience arose, to try our best to just relax and let go, and then keep going, and this the ability to relax deeply and let go into this kind of edgeless or centerless experience of awareness is the thing that confirms that we can do it, and it confirms that that is always available to us, right? Till it gets to the point of some kind of slightly more fast acting thing happening, and our ability to be able to hold it without reactivity. But to give ourselves a break too for these fast acting things, I mean, that's kind of like a bad place to practice, to see where we are, to assess where we are, the same way it's because it's just intense, if that makes sense. It's kind of like having someone come in here and just yell in my ear and use that as the gauge as to how good my practice is, as opposed to some lesser, more ordinary thing, right? Like, this is where, like, this term we've been kind of talking about a little bit, and I'll try and find this article. I was talking with Eric about it today, on Amanasikara. So this kind of mental non-engagement aspect to Mahamudra, and it's not a forced mental non-engagement, and it caught a lot of slack, and actually Saraha caught a lot of slack by early Tibetan Mahamudra practitioners, because they thought it was a tamping down of what was experienced in the moment. But Amanasikara, this mental non-engagement, literally means not lifting a finger. Right, so all this stuff going on, right? We're just resting into awareness, not lifting a finger, right? And this leads right into the experience of Mahamudra. So the moment we become, quote unquote, self-conscious in our practice is when we're like, oh, wow, there's all this noise. Like, what's going on with my mind? Oh, man, shit, I just did it. Oops, I did it again. I conceived. All I'm doing, I go around and all I do is conceive, and then the moment we can drop it back, so it is a training, like, and it is, again, I've said this in other places, other recordings here, this very much may counter like our fight or flight response mechanism and all sorts of things that have kept humans alive. Because if we're just going to say, hey, I'm just here, I'm not doing anything. I'm practicing like a corpse. And then a tiger comes and eats you. Well, there goes that thing, right? Like, so I'll definitely, say it's not easy, but it is possible, definitely possible. I think somehow accepting, for me at least, that this is useless helps, right? Like this is useless, and this gives me permission to be useless as well. Like I don't need to prove function through non-dual practice, because that's not what it's about too. And I'm not saying that's what you're saying, Malika, but like, I think this kind of creeps in sometimes too, is like, well, like, what is the benefit of this then? Well, the benefit is awakening, and that has nothing to do with being better at work, or and these are the ways that we like have learned in our culture to also begin to quantify this. I say this all the time with people asking me questions about dark retreat, like, well, how can it make me better at work? How can it make me more like killer, like on the like stock trading floor? It's like, it's gonna make you quit your job. Like, good practice makes you quit your job. Good practice makes you drop out. Like, we need more dropouts, because it's beyond thought, it's beyond function, it's beyond structure, it's like post structural. And that's, I think, this is something that's also worth considering, like the complexity of awakening, right? Where it's not just maybe we could say it's not as pretty as we make it, as we want it to be. We want it to be gorgeous and lovely and warm and fuzzy. But think of all the people in our lives, right? Like, just in this small circle of our immediate lives, friends, family, whatever. And then imagine that you're not bound by hope or fear, right? Or concept. And then you're going to go out and do and be in the world. And all the people around you haven't changed. And that gets a little complicated, right? Because just as much as, we're seeking to reduce our labeling onto the world, we are always being labeled too. And so, very easily we can fall right out of the arena of what other people think we should be, because their conception of us, the way they've created us, is in their image, maybe not in the image of what we've become, which is interesting to consider too. So that's complicated, but in a good way, right? I mean, Casey can vouch for it, so that's all we need. Casey Ray and Eric and anyone else who wants to put their hand up.
I was saying Casey's word is all I need personally.
Yes. Good. Well, maybe here we can break and dedicate the merit, and then next week we will move on to Naropa's Abhisiddhi Samanama, or the Summary of the View by Naropa. So maybe we can just dedicate the merit to all sentient beings who are just stuck. They're incarcerated, we could say, by their labeling and their projections, right? Seeking to make the world, the universe, the cosmos in their image constantly. May these beings become massaged by Mahamudra so that they can become free and easy, relaxed. And just let everything be without having to control. So thank you all so much and for putting up with me, and I will see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.